welcome to today's episode of the Balanced Approach podcast. I'm your host, Louis Padian. I hope that you're doing well and are enjoying the podcast and the topics we've covered so far. These podcasts are released every Monday, Wednesday and Friday, so be sure to subscribe wherever you are listening to be kept up to date. So, in today's episode, I thought it'd be useful to do another diet review, and it is quite a common diet, and you may have heard of it around clean eating and whether it is helpful, harmful, or hugely overrated. And if you don't know my background, I am an accredited nutritionist with a master's in nutrition. I'm a personal trainer. I've spent over a decade personal training, and I'm also a NHS health coach and also someone who has struggled with weight in the past and has learned to eat better moving forward. So I feel like I've got quite a well-rounded approach, and hence the name of the Balanced Approach. So first of all, let's discuss what actually is clean eating. So the term clean eating doesn't really have a scientific definition. Few diets are a bit more clear, but clean eating seems to be more new and modern approach to eating, and generally promotes a focus on whole, unprocessed foods perceived as natural, good, whilst avoiding refined grains, added sugars and processed ingredients. So there might be elements of that you think, right, that's fantastic. But if you've listened to this podcast for a while, there's certain words there that you feel might be potentially problematic, such as perceived as natural or good. Again, the origin is murky. We don't really know where it's come from, but it's usually associated with the rise in social media as people wanting to go down a more natural, organic approach to food. And social media has massively boomed this up as people have shared their practices online, came up with ways to promote these ways of eating, and on the whole, at first glance, it can look very positive. We know having more whole foods in your diet, less processed foods, and having a focus on nutrient-dense foods is something that probably we all think is probably beneficial for people. So I thought it'd be best to do a bit of a dive into the actual origins of it, of where we might find of where the trends are. So a 2020 survey of more than 1,200 people between 14 and 24, which I think is really important because that's sort of the age group that tends to promote these sort of ways of eating, found that 55% were familiar with the term clean eating from social media. And I personally think that's quite low. I imagine if you said to most people within that age range, I'd say maybe in the 80s, 90s, I'd expect to be familiar with clean eating. And they found that these 55% were familiar with the term from social media or other online sources or from speaking to people. And the rise in social media in general, like Instagram, Pinterest, ones that are quite visually appearing, seems to be a really significant driver in clean eating's popularity. Again, appealing visuals, people have these really photogenic, meticulously arranged meals, and often not containing certain processed foods, and also talking around potential health benefits of individual ingredients or in things within certain foods. This is where it sort of gets problematic, as entertainment does not equal expertise, as people who are potentially quote unquote in very good shape will promote this way of eating as a way that they've achieved their results, when potentially that might be a reason for it, but also they're not displaying the full picture, potentially the downsides of eating like this. So what we tend to find is that influencers with limited nutritional expertise often promote these really restrictive versions of clean eating, where they might cut out dairy, they might cut out grains, they might cut out all forms of sugar, which again isn't really, people don't do very well, or they don't really understand what sugar is. So they will have like sugar-free cookbooks, but will add honey in, and honey is sugar. So adding honey into a recipe and replacing sort of granulated sugar with honey is very much like for like in the sugar content as well, not just for flavour. So it potentially leads to a lot of confusion, but also massively unrealistic expectations on what is achievable, what people should be doing in order to get optimal health or improve their health, and can feel miles away for a lot of people from where they currently are, and actually get them to feel really guilty or shame about the way they're eating, the way they're potentially providing food for their family, which isn't helpful in any case, especially when people are coming at it from a very uneducated and superiority stance where they're saying, I eat like this and I look like this, therefore you don't look like this because you don't eat like this and that's your fault, massively simplifies a really complex problem. So another 2021 survey from the International Food Information Council further defines consumer beliefs around clean eating. So almost half of those surveyed consider themselves to be clean eaters, so just under 50%, found that clean eaters eat foods that are not highly processed, such as fresh or organic fruits and vegetables. And again, we've discussed fresh versus frozen and how that argument shouldn't really exist. They're both great sources, or tinned or canned food, I should say, fruits and vegetables. In the clean eating community, those things potentially will be demonized. Amongst certain influencers, those things will be demonized as well. And they may prioritize foods that are, or promote foods that are potentially short or very simple ingredients list, or recipes with a very short, simple ingredients list. And 64% of those who were surveyed said that they try to choose foods made with clean ingredients, a very popular but very useless claim, defined as not artificial or synthetic. Again, very, very unsure about the definition of those. And those that are organic, fresh or natural. Again, they all are popular buzzwords that we've probably all seen on social media, but actually mean very little. So what does the actual diet look like? When people tend to say that I'm eating clean at the moment, prioritizing whole grains, if any grains at all, fruits, vegetables, lean protein sources, and potentially some healthy fats in there. There will be variation between that. As we said, there's no clear definition, but that's the sort of trend we see. They will tend to limit processed foods, any drinks with sugar in them or sugary drinks. They may have ones where they add additional honey or blend dates, for example. Again, really, really high sources of sugar. Not necessarily saying they're bad, but again, define the point of saying that these are better options than sugar. They're very much similar. And anything that is what we call refined carbohydrates, or sort of sugars in general. The overall goal of this seems to be to improve health and well-being, potential benefits to weight management, increased energy levels, and better gut health. These are all claims that, again, can be nuanced, very individual, and I wouldn't say there's much evidence to support that this specific way of eating. Again, we can't really say this specific way of eating because there's no real guidelines on what this actually looks like, but will benefit those areas is a bit murky and may cause other issues, which we'll look into. So, pros and cons. Some studies show correlation between whole food-based diets, and again, that's very different. Again, I couldn't find any huge difference between any research on people specifically being prescribed a clean eating diet. Potentially, it would be unethical, as we'll discuss in the cons in a second. But whole foods in general, we know, lower the risk of chronic diseases. 2019 review by Un et al. Found high adherence to dietary patterns rich in fruits, vegetables, whole grains and legumes was associated with reduced risk of cardiovascular disease. That's something that we've spoken about a lot in this podcast, so if that's news to your ears, fantastic. Then having a more whole foods approach is definitely beneficial. However, it's also important to say that correlation, that specifically eating clean, doesn't equal the causation. So there might be other aspects such as physical activity, stress and general lifestyle, social health. All these things can have a big influence on health outcomes as well. So whilst it's important to focus on the dietary aspects, there's definitely nuance there in how we talk about these whole foods and the approach to eating a more whole food diet. There is also a lot of the bigger picture around general lifestyle as well. So most people will say, well, so far so good, Louis, whole foods mainly, limiting processed foods. That is something that you talk about a lot, and which I do. However, the labelling a clean eating approach has many drawbacks, especially amongst the online community that speak around this. So things that are really, really damaging. If you use the word clean, therefore you're saying some foods are dirty, foods that are not included, which has that dichotomous approach. And this sort of links in massively to the mental health or the psychological aspect of dieting. And if you say, well, you've got to eat clean, I'm eating clean at the moment, these are the foods I'm having, therefore the foods that you're not having could be insinuated that they are dirty, which has a huge amount of guilt and shame attached to them. And this is where the balanced approach to eating comes in, that by restricting these foods to a point, again, might not be healthy in general, especially when we talk about sort of processed foods like cake, chocolates, sweets, soft drinks, potentially demonized as well, that in some situations they may be the best choice in your circumstances. So if you are at a party, for example, is a close friend and they are offering you a piece of birthday cake, it is really important that you act in line with your values. And if you value clean eating hugely, that might upset a lot of people. It might devalue your friendship potentially, when actually the healthiest thing in that situation could be, and in a lot of people's situation will be, to have a slice of cake. There are no bad foods, just bad portions, which is a great phrase I came across this week that I have just hammered home mentally. I think is fantastic. So it sort of promotes this dichotomous thinking of good, bad, dirty, clean, healthy, unhealthy, when actually all foods exist on a spectrum and we need to get the portion size right in them, depending on your values, your goals and your preferences. It also sets unrealistic expectations. So focusing on perfect meals, and this is what does my head on social media, is that has this ultra restrictive approach that this is perfection and we should all be striving for it, often at great expense to our mental health, our financial health, our social health. And this can really develop this really unhealthy relationship with food and potentially lead to what we would call sort of disordered eating patterns, an overly restrictive mentality. And that's where people who I often work with get to a position where they can do this for so long and yet they want a slice of chocolate. They feel bad for wanting a slice of chocolate when actually there's nothing wrong with wanting a slice of chocolate. And when they do have it, they feel guilty, shame, and they can't control themselves around it. So they go all in, they potentially binge, and then they feel even worse in that situation. So they restrict again, and it builds this all or nothing relationship with those foods. Again, something else, as I've mentioned, social isolation, strict adherence to a self-defined clean foods can make social gatherings and eating out really difficult and have that friction point there that you don't really need to create and isn't necessarily the healthiest thing. Some of these Buddha bowls that you might see that are clean eating may have 700-800 calories in them, and that's a meal. For people who are trying to lose weight and improve their health, there will be some perfectly good processed foods that could be a good replacement nutritionally, have a diverse amount of nutrients within them, calorically be making sense, having a good amount of protein and fiber in there, and will include some processed foods. If we're looking at people's values, goals, and what's going to improve their health better, then potentially the processed foods might be a better option there. So this is where it gets really murky, and yet there's this superiority complex when people are clean eating, that they feel, that they promote that this is better. If you eat like this, you are better than other people, and I completely disagree with that. And it also isn't financially viable for a lot of people. But there's so many issues with it, but a real big issue that I've already mentioned, but I think it's really important to hammer home, is there's a link between clean eating and what we'd call orthorexia. So orthorexia nervosa is one of the proposed eating disorders that is characterized by unhealthy obsession with clean or healthy eating. And I've worked with people who have sort of shown these symptoms before. There's people that I've worked with in practice personally and in the NHS as well, that have this obsession with clean and healthy eating. And they feel potentially anxious around anything perceived unclean or dirty or bad, develop these rigid dietary rules, and these negatively impact all aspects of their life. They don't eat out with friends, they can't socialise, they can only eat food that they've prepared themselves as they know it's 100% clean. And that sort of isolation impacts people's overall well-being and can even lead to points where they don't have certain foods. So if we take, for example, avocados or oily fish, they might say, well, that's high in fat. Both those foods are high in fat and therefore dirty. They may avoid those foods and therefore be really low in their omega-3 or their essential fatty acids in general. And having a super low-fat diet has detrimental effects to people's hormone levels, especially in women. We can see people who go on really extreme diets or really restrictive diets, like the Cambridge diet, for example, which is another one I'll review. Their hair might fall out, their nails might become really brittle just because of the really low fat content as well. And they start to feel really rubbish because their body isn't getting enough fat in the diet, and plus they're on a really low calorie diet anyway, so they just feel rubbish. So the research supports this as well. So there's a 2019 study by Danoni et al. Found a positive correlation between adherence to restrictive clean eating philosophy and symptoms of orthorexia. So they are quite closely aligned, and this is something that I think is getting proposed as an eating disorder. I'm not too sure whether it's been classified as an eating disorder yet, but again, I'm not saying that if you eat clean you're definitely going to develop one, but for some people that may be the case, and we need to be really, really aware of that. There's also another paper from 2019 that investigated young adults' perceptions of clean eating and its association with disordered eating behaviours. They found that participants who held favourable reviews of restrictive clean eating practices also showed higher scores on measures of disordered eating symptoms. And that's just, again, showing that people who buy into this potentially will be displaying behaviours that we would associate with an eating disorder, which isn't something that we want. And what we need to see is be aware of these behaviours. And again, this isn't me saying that the idea of eating more whole foods is terrible. That is not what I'm saying whatsoever. I'm saying having this really restrictive approach that includes that philosophy alongside lots of other potentially dangerous or damaging philosophies is potentially going to be a recipe for disaster, and is only becoming more prominent on social media as well. So what are the symptoms? So restrictive eating patterns, fear of certain foods, preoccupation with food purity. So again, that might make people really anxious around not having full control over food, and anxiety around perceived unclean foods. Again, this is sort of a more evolving area, and potentially we need to have a look, unfortunately, wait for more research to come out to show the potential damage that is still happening and still occurring. And I think it's really important that I state that not everyone who practices clean eating will develop an eating disorder. Again, it depends on the individual, their pre-existing mental health, and likely that will play a big role as well. So what's my overall perspective? If you can't tell by the tone, I'm not a huge fan, but I do understand the appeal. Clean eating and focus on whole foods, again, can be really blurred between, well, everyone is telling me that I should eat more whole foods and this clean eating includes that, therefore clean eating is a good option. Not necessarily. It really lacks that nuance. And the strict labelling of foods as good or bad, clean, dirty, or unclean can be really problematic further down the line, build really poor relationships with those foods. A balanced approach to dieting includes a variety of nutrient-dense foods from all groups. And again, I said some of these practices might exclude dairy, and there's a huge amount of health benefits to including dairy within your diet. Again, depending on your selection, your dose, your goals, your values, all these things. But also, foods that aren't as nutritionally dense, there's huge health benefits to them in people having a healthier and sustained and happier life. So clean eating can be a stepping stone towards a healthier lifestyle for some people, but it definitely needs understanding of the dangers around it. And I would definitely ask people not to approach or undertake a clean eating diet. And I always pull patients and clients upon it when they mention that I'm eating clean at the moment. So what do you mean by clean? And that might mean that I'm having more whole foods. Well, fantastic. That if that's the definition for you, brilliant. But be aware that it can be a really restrictive and slippery slope. And this is where the personalisation with dieting comes in, that depending on the people's preferences, values, goals, where it might increase certain amounts of food in the diet, or affordability is a big part of it as well. This is what we need to consider, that we shouldn't just get a copy and paste plan from an influencer online who says, all my problems are caused by me having any grains in my diet, eating dairy, eating gluten, eating meats. There's no issues with those foods individually. And again, we need to look at the portions and amounts and frequency that we're having. There are no bad foods, only bad portions. From a fitness perspective, it's so popular within those groups, especially if we look at the CrossFit community. They sort of may promote very similar messaging around sugar being terrible for you, and actually in CrossFit you're doing lots of high intensity work, which the energy system that you need, or you'll be taxing a lot, is glucose. So actually including sugars within your diet is actually really beneficial, and we shouldn't get caught up in the clean, unclean, bad, good, dirty mix at all. Actually, food is food. It all exists on a spectrum depending on our values and goals. So that's where that flexibility comes in, and understanding the nutrient composition of foods is really useful. Again, things like tracking your calories can be really useful for that, to understand what's actually in certain foods, but understanding what those foods and what those nutrients do as well, and the role that they play, that we don't really, neither fats, carbs or proteins are bad. They're actually really beneficial for our overall health. And again, we need to manage the amounts and the amounts and the percentage of our food that's coming from each, and the source of those foods as well. And as someone who's experienced various approaches in diet in the past, clean eating was something that I've tried in the past and thought certain foods are bad. Probably something that I was exposed to probably close to about 10 years ago. Didn't really suit me, as I knew that I crave these foods, but I did slip into it at some points and displayed some potentially dangerous behaviours around really restrictive with certain aspects of food. But I can see the appeal because the messaging is really simple. Just cut these foods out, only eat these. Fantastic. But that can come at a big cost mentally, financially, time-wise as well. And this is another thing that sort of having ready-made versions of food is demonized within these communities often. So again, I'd say someone who is really stressed, has a full-time job, family to care for, and all these sorts of things, potentially the healthiest thing that they can do to save some time so they can spend time with their family, because that's what they value, would be having some more easier options, potentially pre-prepared foods, potentially some more processed foods within their diet, as long as you look at the caloric content, the nutrients within them, and look at the frequency of that as well. Could be a good thing moving forward for them, rather than getting caught up in trying to cook from scratch, have super organic foods, which only adds to time stresses, financial stresses as well. This is why it's so important to discuss these topics in depth, discuss the nuance on them, because there's a lot to take on. So it's important from my perspective that the messaging that you take away is that clean eating and eating a whole foods diet are very, very different. With the rigidity, with the health benefits, with the psychological and mental health aspects as well. 100% people could do with eating more fruits and vegetables in their diets, including more whole grains, having lean protein sources regularly, and including their unsaturated fats more regularly within their diets. Does that mean that we shouldn't have foods that don't contain any sort of nutrients, vitamins, minerals? Something that's going to be higher in fat, high in carbs, not very high in protein, low in sort of vitamins and minerals. Doesn't mean that we should avoid those foods. We should moderate the amounts that we have them and actually learn to eat them mindfully as well, and actually enjoy them. Again, that's something else that people tend to do when they're being really restricted to their food, is that they don't actually even enjoy the foods or have time to enjoy them because they feel so guilty and shameful for eating them. They just get them all down in one go and get them out of sight, out of mind, out of the house as quick as possible. Actually, that's not enjoying them in any aspect. So maybe us having them more frequently and being exposed to them more often in smaller amounts where we can actually enjoy them mindfully might be a better approach, and mindful eating is a big part of this as well. Be careful of demonizing foods. Language around food, so important. So if you feel yourself going, well, this is a bad food, a bad time to eat this food, this is unhealthy, this is dirty, I'm eating clean at the moment, I'm being good, all things that we should probably challenge internally and say, right, so where's that come from? Is there any evidence to support or against it? And actually, it's just something that we've learned or someone's told us that we've taken to be factual, and often it doesn't really mean anything or isn't stopping us achieving our goals. So having some flexibility in there as well. And if you're unsure on how to do that, obviously I'm here. So reach out to me on social media through the links below in the podcast. That's what I'm here for. If you need any help and support, that's what I'm here for. Remember, whilst health is important and us looking for things like better body fat percentages or better muscle mass gains and getting more variety in our diet is fantastic, a healthy relationship with food is just as important as those things. So if you're changing things within your diet, within your activity, within your daily lifestyle, in a pursuit of health, potentially you're saying low body fat might be as a way to improve health, taking a step back and going, if I look at health holistically, is this potentially damaging my relationship with food, with exercise? Is it making me more rigid? Is there rules attached to it? Because these are the things that we should be questioning, and this is why lots of people on social media are going viral with really damaging messages, because it's really simple to say grains are bad, take them out of your diet and you'll lose weight. If you take all unprocessed foods out of your diet, all processed foods out of your diet, that's the problem and it's your fault. You need to take responsibility and have an unprocessed diet. You need to eat clean. Then it's a really simple message. People can pretty much picture what they should, within the rules of this diet, be eating. But there's lots of barriers, obstacles, problems further down the road with that approach, and the deeper you get into it, the harder it is to come back. So taking a more balanced approach, yes, it's not as sexy and it takes a bit more of a learning curve, but it's allowing you to eat for life in a more balanced approach, enjoy all aspects of life and get the results you want. You might not get them as quicker, you might have to think about things a bit more, but actually it's a lot more sustainable and enjoyable and healthy long term. So there you have it. Thank you very much for listening to today's episode of the Balanced Approach podcast. If you have any questions, queries, or would like to reach out to me, please do. I am at Louis Padian Nutrition, which is at LOUISPADIAN Nutrition on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and all other social media platforms. If you're looking for support in achieving your goals and living a healthier, happier, and more balanced life in the process, click the link below and inquire about working with me. Remember to subscribe to the Balanced Approach podcast wherever you're listening for more insightful episodes, and I look forward to speaking to you soon.